74,000 years ago, a mountain in Sumatra collapsed into itself and released 6 years of winter across the planet. The eruption of Mount Toba was not a volcano in any familiar sense. It was a rupture in the Earth's crust so violent that it ejected 2,800 cubic kilometers of rock and ash into the stratosphere. The debris cloud circled the globe in weeks. Sulfur dioxide mixed with water vapor and formed aerosol particles that reflected sunlight back into space. Global temperatures dropped by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. In some regions, the decline reached 15 degrees. The ash fell across South Asia in layers thick enough to bury vegetation and choke rivers. It drifted across the Indian Ocean and settled over East Africa. In the Middle East, it turned the sky gray for months. The fossil record suggests that plant life collapsed across tropical and subtropical zones. Large herbivores died first, followed by the predators that depended on them. Pollen samples from lake beds show a sudden disappearance of tree species and a surge in grasses adapted to cold and disturbance. The world did not end, but it became unrecognizable. Somewhere in this collapsing ecosystem, small bands of early humans continued to exist. They were anatomically modern, but culturally young. They had no agriculture, no metal tools, no written language. Their survival depended entirely on observation, memory, and the transmission of practical knowledge across generations. They had no way to understand what had happened to the sky. They could only respond to the consequences. The question is not whether they were intelligent. The question is whether their intelligence was oriented toward the right problems. A modern human dropped into a post-Toba environment would likely die within weeks, not from lack of effort, but from a fundamental mismatch between cognitive training and environmental demand. Contemporary survival knowledge is largely procedural. It assumes access to materials, the availability of rescue, and the existence of stable ecosystems. It does not account for the collapse of food chains, the toxicity of water sources, or the sudden absence of animal migration patterns that have structured human behavior for millennia. Ancient humans did not have better tools, they had better systems. Their cognition was not oriented toward innovation in the modern sense. It was oriented toward pattern recognition, risk assessment, and the social enforcement of behaviors that had proven effective under pressure. They were not optimizing for comfort. They were optimizing for survival across generations, which required a fundamentally different calculus. The behaviors that kept a group alive during the ash winter were often invisible, embedded in daily routines that appeared mundane until the environment turned hostile. The archaeological record from this period is sparse, but what exists suggests a dramatic population bottleneck. Genetic studies estimate that the global human population may have dropped to as few as 10,000 individuals. Some models place the number lower. The survivors were not randomly distributed. They clustered in specific refugia where conditions remained marginally tolerable. Coastal regions in southern Africa, river valleys in East Africa, possibly cave systems in the Levant. These were not safe zones. They were places where the rate of death was slightly slower than the rate of birth. The humans who survived Toba did so by exploiting environmental margins that industrial societies have spent centuries trying to eliminate. Coastlines provided access to shellfish, which were less affected by atmospheric cooling than terrestrial food sources. Tidal zones were predictable. They did not require tracking or pursuit. They required only knowledge of lunar cycles and an understanding of which species were edible and which were toxic. This was not simple knowledge. It required multi-generational observation and the social structures to ensure that dangerous mistakes were not repeated. Inland groups survived by shifting their diets toward foods that modern humans would consider inedible. tubers and roots that required hours of processing to remove toxins, insects and larvae that provided protein when larger animals disappeared, bone marrow extracted from carcasses that other scavengers had abandoned. These foods were labor-intensive and often unpalatable, but they were reliable. They did not migrate. They did not require tools beyond sharpened stones and fire. Fire itself became more than a source of warmth. It was a detoxification technology, a social gathering point, and a signal that the group was maintaining continuity. The survival strategies that worked were not heroic. They were repetitive, exhausting, and deeply conservative. Groups that experimented with new food sources during periods of scarcity often paid for that experimentation with their lives. Groups that adhered to established knowledge, even when it seemed insufficient, had a marginally better chance of surviving long enough to reproduce. This created a selection pressure not just for intelligence, but for a specific kind of intelligence, the ability to suppress novelty-seeking behavior in favor of tested routines, even when those routines delivered only minimal returns. Human survival during the Toba event was not primarily a biological problem. It was a cultural one. The groups that survived were those that maintained cohesion under conditions that would normally fracture social bonds. Starvation erodes cooperation. Scarcity amplifies competition. In small populations, a single violent conflict can eliminate the genetic diversity necessary for long-term survival. The archaeological record contains evidence of violence during this period, but it also contains evidence of care. Skeletons with healed fractures, elderly individuals who survived long past their reproductive years, infants buried with ochre and shells, suggesting ritual attention to the dead. These practices were not sentimental, they were functional. A group that abandoned its injured or expelled its elderly lost access to accumulated knowledge. A group that failed to invest in the next generation lost its future. The cultural mechanisms that enforced these behaviors were often harsh. Exile was a death sentence. Theft of resources during famine was likely met with immediate and severe punishment. But these mechanisms existed because groups that lacked them disappeared from the record. The transmission of survival knowledge required more than verbal instruction. It required demonstration, repetition, and the social infrastructure to ensure that young members of the group were physically present during critical tasks. A child who learned to identify edible plants by accompanying adults during foraging had a vastly higher chance of surviving into adulthood than one who did not. This created a selection pressure for extended childhood, prolonged parental investment, and the formation of social bonds that extended beyond immediate family units. Not all human groups survived. The genetic evidence suggests that entire lineages disappeared during the millennia following the eruption. Some of these extinctions were likely rapid, the result of immediate starvation or disease. Others were slower, the result of reproductive collapse in populations that fell below critical thresholds. A group of 30 individuals can lose genetic viability in 3 generations if environmental stress prevents successful reproduction. A group of 50 can survive, but only if cultural mechanisms prevent inbreeding and ensure the health of offspring. The groups that failed were not necessarily less intelligent, they were less lucky, or they were committed to strategies that had worked in previous environments, but became lethal under new conditions. Populations that relied heavily on megafauna hunting would have faced catastrophic food shortages as those species declined. Groups that occupied inland regions without access to fallback resources would have had no buffer against prolonged cold. Coastal populations in northern latitudes would have faced different pressures than those in the tropics, and the solutions that worked in one context would have been useless in another. The collapse of these groups left no monuments, no written records, no oral histories. What remains are gaps in the genetic data and the sudden disappearance of tool traditions from the archaeological record. The human species came closer to extinction during this period than at any other point in its history. The survival of even a few thousand individuals required not just intelligence, but the alignment of that intelligence with environmental realities that no individual could fully comprehend.
The humans who survived the Toba bottleneck were not superhuman. They were the descendants of lineages that had already endured previous environmental catastrophes, and they carried with them the cognitive and cultural adaptations that had been selected for across hundreds of thousands of years. What changed after Toba was not human biology, but the consolidation of behaviors that worked under the most extreme conditions. The survivors were the product of a filter so severe that it removed every group whose survival strategies contained even minor flaws. This created a legacy that persists in modern populations, the preference for routine over novelty in high-stakes situations, the tendency to defer to accumulated knowledge even when it seems outdated, the deep-seated anxiety about resource scarcity that drives hoarding behavior in times of uncertainty. These are not bugs in human cognition, they are features selected for during a period when the alternative was extinction.
The Toba event also left a genetic signature. Modern human populations show evidence of a dramatic loss of diversity roughly 70,000 years ago, followed by a slow recovery. The survivors carried only a fraction of the genetic variation that had existed in earlier populations. This made humans more vulnerable to certain diseases and environmental changes, but it also created a species that was remarkably uniform in its cognitive architecture. The humans who repopulated the planet after Toba shared not just genes, but cultural frameworks for survival that had been tested under conditions that no modern society has ever faced. The intelligence that allowed ancient humans to survive was not the intelligence of innovation or creativity. It was the intelligence of endurance, the ability to maintain social cohesion across generations, the willingness to invest in knowledge that might not pay off for decades, the recognition that survival is not an individual achievement, but a collective one, built on the accumulated wisdom of those who came before. That inheritance is not romantic, but it is real, and it is the reason any of us exist to ask the question at all.